Dear prospective tenant, my name is 𝙎𝙩𝙤𝙣 and I'm an associate attorney at STBB. Today, we're quickly going to run through the most important provisions contained in the CCH lease agreement that you as a tenant need to be aware of before signing the lease agreement. I would like to begin by going to the schedule. The schedule is the first 5 pages to the lease agreement and is a very short summary of all the important information that you need to know that will also be referred to later in the lease agreement. You will see in schedule paragraph 1 it refers to the agent, the landlord. 1.4 is a formal description of the property that you will be letting. And then also take note 1.8, the tenant's costs. That will be the rental per month, the method of payment that will be done, the deposit that will be held, 1.9, and then also the lease administration fee that you as tenant will need to cover together with a credit check fee, and then also 1.13, very important to take note of, the rental escalation after this lease has expired and a new lease has been entered into. In practice, the standard escalation is between 7 and 10%. Just have a look at 1.13 and make sure that you are aware of what your annual escalation will be. Then the next page, page 4, 1.16, it's just the tenant's nominated bank account. Please complete that because at the end of the lease period, the landlord or CCH in this case will have to reimburse you your deposit and they will need to pay that into that designated account. And then also 1.17, it's the landlord's nominated bank account. That just contains the banking details wherein you need to pay the monthly rental. Then also 1.18, it's the landlord's details. There will be an email address contained in that clause, very important. And then tenant, your contact details needs to be completed in 1.19, also very important. Please add an email address to that particulars. Next page, page 5, the last page of the schedule, 1.20 just contains the agent's contact details. 1.21, important to take note of, there's an interest rate of 2% per month on arrears rental payable. So what that means is ensure that you pay your rental timelessly on the 1st of every month, or depending on what your lease agreement states. In this particular instance, the lease agreement requires you as a tenant to pay your rental on the 1st of every month. There will be a penalty interest payable of 2% on late payments. And then 1.26, it just contains the date on when the keys needs to be returned to CCH after the lease period has expired and you as the tenant would elect to cancel the lease agreement and move somewhere else. And then also, very important, 1.29, a maximum cancellation penalty. We'll get to that later, but keep in mind for now that when you as a tenant are allowed under the Consumer Protection Act to cancel a lease agreement before it expires. But just keep in mind, because you are cancelling a fixed term agreement prematurely, you will obviously have to be held liable for certain damages, and this is where the minimum cancellation penalty comes in. We'll have a look at that later. Then on to the lease agreement itself. Clause 2, it begins with a lot of definitions. You can just read through that. Everything is actually self-explanatory. We can just quickly have a look at 2.13, fair wear and tear. It's important to take note of the meaning of fair wear and tear. Why is that important? At the end of a lease period, the deposit paid by yourself can be used to deduct any damages that was caused by yourself to the property during the lease period. So fair wear and tear will not be an allowable deduction. Only malicious damages like cracking a tile or breaking a window, but fair wear and tear is excluded. And then also just have a look at the meaning of month in 2.18. A month means a calendar month, commencing on the first day of such month and terminating on the last day of the month. Then we can move over to clause 3. Also just very basic. It contains additional definitions, and it also just states that the single includes the plural, and he also includes she. Then we can quickly go on to clause 4, self-explanatory. Clause 5, the term of the lease agreement, also pretty self-explanatory. It's also contained in the schedule, that first 5 pages that we just discussed. The term of the lease agreement will also be included. Usually, it is common practice to conclude a lease agreement for 12 months. Then clause 6, continuation of the lease agreement. Now this is very important. It happens that a tenant signs a lease agreement for 12 months, and the question is what happens after the lease agreement has expired. In terms of this, it provides that the lease automatically goes onto a month-to-month basis, and that means that all the terms and conditions contained in your lease agreement stays exactly the same. Just take note that if an annual escalation is applicable, you'll have to calculate your new rental payable from the month it expires until that month-to-month contract has also been cancelled. So the parties can either, after the initial lease period has terminated, enter into a new lease agreement to extend the current one, or they can enter into an addendum, just plainly fixing a new lease period, or they can just simply cancel the lease. In practice, we see a lot that parties just add an addendum to the original and existing lease agreement, and then just amend the new period and also the rental payable, taking into consideration the annual increase. Then termination of the fixed term lease agreement, the one that you will be signing. Please take note that there is a duty on the landlord, and then therefore also the landlord's agent, to notify you, the tenant, at least 40 days, but not more than 80 days before this lease agreement, the period before it expires. You need to receive a notification, firstly informing you that this lease agreement will expire within the next 2 or 3 months. Secondly, it needs to ask you the question of whether you are intending to stay on in the premises. And then thirdly, if so, you need to conclude a new lease agreement. Clause 8, use of the premises. As you know, this will be a residential property and it can only be used for residential purposes. Very important, clause 9, house and body corporate rules. If the property that you would be letting is in a sectional title complex or one that is run by a homeowners association, there will obviously be conduct rules and management rules, and you as a tenant will be required to adhere to those rules, and any breach of those rules will constitute a breach of this lease agreement. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you have a friend that comes and visits 3 times a week. There are designated parking spaces for a visitor. If your visitor refuses to park on a visitor's parking and rather go and park on someone else's parking bay, he can get a written notice, and that written notice will come over to you and obviously reflect as a fine against the owner's levy statement, which in essence will place you in breach of the lease agreement. So please ensure that you and also your family or friends that comes over adhere to the rules of the body corporate. Upon signing of this lease agreement, you will get a copy from CCH of these 2 respective rules. Make sure that you read through it and understand what it contains. Then let's go over to clause 10. Very important as well, the rental. The tenant must ensure that the rental clears in the landlord's nominated bank account on the 1st of each and every month. The tenant will be charged interest on any overdue rental at the rate set out in 1.21. We referred to that clause previously. It was in the schedule, and the penalty interest will be 2% on late payments. calculated from the first day of the month on which such rental was due until the date of payment of such rental. Also, the rental cannot be reduced by the tenant for any reason whatsoever. There is various case law that confirms this. Let's say for the sake of argument there's a broken geyser and the landlord has been notified, and for some reason 3 months has passed and the broken geyser is still not fixed. That isn't grounds for a tenant to withhold a certain portion of the rental. The landlord is still entitled to the full rental payment as agreed to between the parties in this lease agreement. And then also just take note, the rental will increase annually by the percentage set out in 1.13 in the schedule. As I said, in practice it's usually between 7% and 10%. Okay, clause 11, charges by the service provider. Each property will differ. You will get a property that has a preloaded electrical meter where you as the tenant buy your electricity yourself and then you just load it. In another property, you will be making use of the municipal account of the landlord, and he will provide you with a monthly bill of electricity and water service charges that you need to pay. So just make sure you are aware of what your property entails. Will you be allowed to buy the electricity and water yourself, or will you have to pay that directly over to the landlord as well, in addition to your monthly rental? Because clause 11 makes provision for service charges that a tenant also needs to pay up and above the monthly rental. Just also in clause 11, take note of 11.6, which reads that if the levies, this is now if the property is situated in a sectional title complex, if the levies, rates and or taxes in respect of the premises increases at any time during the subsistence of this lease agreement, the landlord shall be entitled to increase the rental to accommodate such increase in the levies, rates and taxes. So please just take note of that. Then clause 12, pretty self-explanatory. We've already referred to the additional charges payable by the tenant. That will be the charges of doing a credit check by CCH and then also the lease administration fee. Then clause 13, the deposit, very important. The tenant will pay the deposit on the signature date of this lease agreement. And when the lease agreement terminates, the landlord may use this deposit together with any interest accumulated thereon to pay all amounts which the tenant is liable for in terms of this lease agreement. And that includes the reasonable costs of repairing any damages. Remember, we said earlier that a tenant will be liable for any damages or defects to the property that the tenant caused during the lease period. But excluded from that is fair wear and tear. A rug that has experienced fair wear and tear, the costs of replacing that rug cannot be deducted from this deposit. But as I've just mentioned, things that can be deducted is the reasonable cost of repairing any damages caused by the tenant to the premises, or the cost of replacing lost keys, or any arrears rental that was not paid by the tenant, and any other outstanding amount to which the tenant is liable for under this lease agreement. Just take note of that. Also, the deposit will be placed in an interest-bearing account with a financial institution. When the lease agreement terminates, after deducting any amounts owned by the tenant in terms of the provisions of this lease agreement, the balance will be paid out to the tenant, if not the full amount. And this will include the interest that accrued on your deposit. And this will be done within 14 days after the outgoing inspection has been done at the property. We're still under clause 13. Just quickly, let's have a look at 13.5, which reads that the deposit at all times belongs to the tenant and may only be utilized by the landlord or agent, as the case may be, upon termination of this lease agreement. So what that basically means is when you, the tenant, move into the property, you pay a deposit. That deposit gets invested in an interest-bearing account for your benefit until the lease expires. During the lease period, that deposit cannot be touched. that remains your deposit, and only once this lease agreement has expired can that deposit be utilized to deduct allowable deductions like damages caused by the tenant, the loss of replacing lost keys, and the other examples that we used, but not during the lease period. It's not possible to touch the deposit then, unless the landlord and the tenant entered into an addendum that's whereby they mutually agree that the deposit can be utilized for something. And now during COVID, that's something that we saw in practice a lot, because a tenant wasn't able to pay his full monthly rental. What the parties did is that they entered into an addendum to the lease agreement saying that the deposit held by the landlord can be utilized to pay the current outstanding rental. That in essence is, for me, not advisable, because remember, at the end of the day, this lease agreement will expire and the tenant will have to move out, and an outgoing inspection will have to be done. And what happens in a situation where you've already utilized the whole deposit towards arrears rental, and now at the end of the lease period you do your outgoing inspection, and unfortunately you as tenant didn't look after that property, and now there's no deposit to deduct any damages from. And that will mean a landlord will be able to claim it from you, and that is something that you would like to prevent at all times. So what I'm just basically saying is that always ensure that the deposit remains with the rental agents until the day the lease agreement has expired. It can only be touched then. Then let's move over to clause 14, inspection of the property. This basically says that the tenant and the landlord, or the landlord's agent, will inspect the premises together. The tenant and the landlord, or the landlord's agent, needs to be present before the tenant takes occupation of the property. This is just to determine by compiling a formal list of what the defects are. So when the tenant moves out and there's allegedly a broken window, if that broken window was there during the ingoing inspection and is still there during the outgoing inspection, the landlord can't argue that you as the tenant were the cause of that broken window, because an informal ingoing inspection was done and it was recorded that there is a broken window. That's the reason for an ingoing inspection, to formalize and put in writing the current condition of the property. So, as I said, the purpose is to record any defects or damages in writing, and just take note that this recordal does not constitute an acknowledgement by the landlord to have the defects fixed. Obviously, if it's something significant like a broken geyser, the landlord will attend to that. But small things, say for example if there's a broken tile in the kitchen, one can live with a broken tile. Just simply recording it doesn't mean the landlord is going to fix that tile. It just means that that broken tile was broken when you moved in, and no one can at the end of the lease period say that you were the cause. The recordal is simply an acknowledgement that the defect or damages exist and that the damage or defect was not caused by the tenant. If the tenant discovers any damages or defects to the premises after the inspection was done that we just referred to, the tenant shall notify the landlord in writing of such damages or defects within 7 days of the date of the discovery of such defect. The landlord shall supply the tenant with a written acknowledgement confirming that such damage or defect exists, and shall be entitled to inspect such damage or defect within a reasonable time to have it fixed. Then also quickly 14.5, the landlord shall be entitled to whistle at the inspection of the premises. The landlord shall be entitled to deduct any amount from the deposit required to repair any damages caused to the premises. We've already emphasized that. And to charge the tenant for any amount over and above the value of the deposit if the cost of repairing the damage amounts to more than the amount that is held as a deposit. So let's say, for the sake of argument, there is a deposit of 10,000 Rand. During your birthday month, there was a huge party at the property and somehow managed to break the whole roof, you will be held liable for that damages, and the cost of replacing a roof will be at least 100,000 rand. And if the landlord only has 10,000 rand deposit, you can utilize that 10,000 rand and issue a summons against you for the balance of that. So just take note of that. Maintenance and repair work, we're now at clause 15. The tenant must timeously complete and repair work for which he is responsible for under this lease agreement. We will see in clause 17 what your obligations as tenant is. If the tenant fails to do so, the landlord shall be entitled to have such work completed by a third party and may claim any costs incurred in respect of such completion of such work. Just basically means that if you are, in terms of this lease agreement, required to maintain the garden, and after 6 months moving into the property, you've not had it cleaned once. This clause allows the landlord to appoint a third party to do the work, and then upon receipt of an invoice, send it to you as tenant to have it paid. Now clause 15.2. If the tenant discovers that maintenance or repair work needs to be done, which the tenant is not responsible for in terms of this agreement, the tenant shall inform the landlord in writing. Please do that, because your failure to do that will mean that you are in essence and indirectly contributing towards the landlord's damages, and you can be held responsible for that. Failing to inform a landlord of a leaking geyser over a 6-month period means that damages will be so extensive that the costs are going to be twice as much to have it fixed than, let's say, 5 months ago. So very important, just remember there's a duty on you to inform the landlord of any defects to the property that needs to be fixed. That's for his account. Then let's go to clause 16, reasonable access to the premises by the landlord. Obviously, as a tenant, you have your right to privacy while staying at the property, but if a landlord gives you reasonable notice, he must be given access to that property, but that will only be for doing repair work. So just take note of that as well. And now we are getting to clause 17, the general obligations of the tenant. My advice to you is to take the time to read through this whole clause. It's very extensive. It clearly contains what you are obligated to do while living in the property. I'm not going to go through everything. I'm just briefly going to mention the most important points. So the tenant must, at his own costs, look after the premises. That means looking after the garden and the pool and making sure that the gate is working. This is just from a maintenance perspective. This is not from fixing something that is broken. If there's a leaking roof, that's not your responsibility. The property remains the property of the landlord, and he will be responsible for fixing the roof. But you have a duty to maintain the roof. Please ensure that the gutters are clean at all time. Ensure that the garden is mowed. Get someone out to clean the pool. Then also regularly clean the inside of the premises, including the carpets and floors. That's obvious. Maintain, replace and repair all electrical globes. Repair and replace any broken, damaged or missing items within the premises that belongs to the landlord, which you have caused. If you have managed to somehow broke a window, please replace that as soon as possible, because if not, at the outgoing inspection, the costs of getting that window replaced can be deducted from your deposit. And then also to take all the reasonable steps to prevent any blockage and or obstruction of any drains, sewage pipes and or water pipes in or around the property. Respect the rights of use and enjoyment of neighbours. Comply with all laws and regulations relating to the property. Ensure that the property are occupied by no more than the number of people as pointed out into this lease agreement. It is going to be contained in the schedule in clause 1.28. Make payments of all amounts which the landlord is legally entitled to. That's pretty obvious. And also very important, return the premises at the termination date of this lease agreement back to the landlord in the condition that you found it in. And then this lease agreement just goes on, pointing out certain obligations in relation to if you're a smoker or if you will be keeping pets on the property. I'm also going to point this out: the tenant must not sublet the premises or allow any third party to reside in or occupy the premises without the prior written consent of the landlord. Very, very important. And then also the tenant must not allow any refuse to accumulate inside or outside the premise, save for rubbish in a rubbish bin. And then also make any structural changes or additions to the premises. Remember, if you are going to add additions to the property without the landlord's consent or some sort of agreement, you can't be reimbursed for any costs that you incurred because you didn't have the landlord's approval to do that. So make sure that you discuss with your landlord if you intend to repaint the whole property at your own costs. And also important, you must not interfere with the electrical, plumbing or gas system. Then let's go to clause 18, visitors of the tenant. A tenant must, and we also explained this already, a tenant must use his best endeavours to ensure that the visitors to the premises at all times comply with the provisions of this lease agreement and also the conduct rules and the management rules of the sectional title development. Then clause 19, that's just a little bit of legal jargon, joint and several liability. This just means if there are two tenants, both of them will be liable towards the landlord for any outstanding amount, jointly and severally liable. Then clause 20, it's a standard condition, you can just read through that. Now, probably the most important condition contained in a lease agreement is the cancellation of this lease agreement, clause 21, cancellation of this lease agreement by the tenant before the expiry of the initial period or any further fixed term period. So what this means is the following. If this lease agreement is concluded for a year, 2 months into the lease agreement, you've now received a position in Johannesburg and you need to cancel this lease agreement because you need to move as soon as possible. But there's still 10 months left of this lease agreement. What now? Can you cancel this lease agreement? Will there be any costs involved? So, in terms of section 14, paragraph 2 of the Consumer Protection Act, a tenant is allowed to prematurely cancel a fixed term agreement. But the tenant must remember that he will be held liable for a reasonable cancellation penalty. And what does that mean? In practice, the concept of a reasonable cancellation penalty is a very academical argument because you'll have to go and look at each situation, and there's certain questions that needs to be asked before determining what a reasonable cancellation penalty will be. The Act specifically refers to the following factors, and I see CCH actually included some of these factors in the lease agreement, and it is the following factors that will be considered when determining the reasonable cancellation penalty. Will include the amount of time left until the initial period is due to terminate, meaning in our example there's still 10 months left, whether the landlord is likely to find another tenant to replace yourself within a reasonable time, and whether the tenant agrees this is a fair and a reasonable cancellation penalty. In practice, a reasonable cancellation penalty is usually 1 month's rental. But let's go back to our example of you've entered into a fixed term lease agreement of 12 months, 2 months has passed and you now need to cancel this lease for whatever reason. Let's say for the sake of argument, the landlord or CCH can't manage to find a new tenant. Then your cancellation penalty might be more, and one will need to take into all these factors to derive at a reasonable cancellation penalty. But luckily in practice, the agents usually manage to find a replacement tenant very quickly, but just take note that your reasonable cancellation penalty for early cancellation will be at least 1 month's rental. Then clause 22, cancellation of this lease agreement by the landlord. A landlord is entitled to cancel a lease when you as the tenant have been placed in breach, given a certain amount of days to rectify your breach, and after that amount of days has still not complied with your obligation. In such an instance, a landlord will be entitled to cancel the lease agreement and you will have to vacate the property as soon as possible. But this agreement also contains two other provisions of when the landlord can cancel the lease agreement. It reads that the landlord may in his sole discretion cancel this lease agreement on 2 months written notice in the following circumstances. The landlord intends to move into the premises or the landlord intends to sell the property. I can just perhaps give you some legal advice on that last point. The landlord intends to sell the premises. If you conclude a lease agreement for a year, a month after you've moved into the property, the landlord informed you that he just sold the property, Mr. X is now the new owner and therefore also the new landlord. But now the new landlord or owner is insisting that he wants to move into the property and you need to vacate as soon as possible. That won't be possible. You, as a tenant with a fixed term lease agreement, have a legal remedy in law, what we refer to is as 𝙎𝙩𝙤𝙦𝙦𝙦𝙦𝙦𝙦, which means that your lease agreement for the lease period trumps any other agreement that there might have been. So you will be legally allowed to live out your lease period in that property, and only after expiration of this lease will you be required to move and not before. So then that's just that. Clause 23 and 24 we've just also briefly touched on. Then clause 25, acknowledgement by the tenant. What this just basically says is that by signing this lease agreement, you acknowledge that you've read through everything, you understand through everything, and that you don't have any questions. Clause 26 refers to costs. This is just for should the landlord or the tenant institute a litigation action against each other, the defaulting party will be liable to pay costs to the innocent party. Clause 27, letters and notices. If you, the tenant, would like to place the landlord in breach, there is a broken geyser, and you need to have it fixed as soon as possible, you need to inform the landlord. If he refuses to do that, you can cancel the lease agreement after giving him a certain amount of days to rectify his breach. And this is also vice versa. If you fail to comply with your obligations in terms of this lease agreement, let's say for the sake of argument, you fail to pay your rental, the landlord can place you in breach of the lease agreement and subsequently cancel the agreement. Clause 28, legal jargon, jurisdiction of the magistrate's court. It just basically means that if a civil action is instituted, it must be done in the magistrate's court and not the high court. Clause 29, perhaps just important to very briefly look at that. Tenants who are foreigners. If the tenant is not a citizen or permanent resident of South Africa, he confirms that he is not in the country in contravention of the Immigration Act, and he has permission to be in the country, especially during this lease period. Then clause 30, pretty straightforward. Clause 31, pretty straightforward. That's actually more applicable to the rental agents than you. Clause 32, non-variations. This also just states that this lease agreement is the final lease agreement once signed between the parties. Everything, all agreements, terms and conditions that the parties agree to needs to be contained in this lease agreement. And the terms and conditions hereof can only be amended if the parties mutually agree to it and put it in writing. Clause 33, landlord's hypothec. This just means that should you as the tenant be in breach of your payment obligation, the landlord can issue a summons against you and he can instruct the sheriff to write up your movable property. That is the landlord's hypothec. He is allowed to attach your property and use it as security for the debt owed to him. Clause 34 and 35, pretty straightforward. Clause 36, signature. This lease agreement shall be signed in writing. 37, deed of surety, straightforward. Clause 38, managing agent, not applicable to you guys. Clause 39, marketing the premise to prospective tenants or purchasers. Just also take note of this. The landlord shall be entitled to display a to-let sign at the premises 3 months prior to the termination date. And also, he will be allowed to display a for sale sign should the landlord decide to sell the property. Just also remember that during the 3 months before this lease agreement expires, the tenants, the landlord's agents will be entitled to take prospective tenants into the property to show them in order to complete a new lease agreement. And very briefly, that's. Should you have any questions, you are more than welcome to contact myself at STBB for any questions.